The marble countertop in the kitchen was always pristine. It was a cold white stage designed for a man who could not tell a shallot from a common onion. Leo stood there, perfectly framed by the soft studio lights, waiting for the red tally light to blink on. He did not know how to sear a scallop, or why a reduction needed time to thicken. He only knew how to look at the lens and smile. He reached for a knife, his movements hesitant and overly dramatic, mimicking the motions of a professional he had seen in a video months ago. The pan sat on the burner, already smoking, yet he stared at the ingredients as if they were written in a foreign language. He did not understand the chemistry of the heat or the way the oil needed to shimmer before the protein hit the surface. He simply waited for the signal. He adjusted his posture, flashed that practiced, golden hour grin directly into the glass, and began to recite the script I had spent until 3 in the morning perfecting. The pan hissed as he dropped a cold slab of butter into the center, the sound sharp and aggressive in the quiet room. He did not flinch. He just kept talking. I watched him from the suffocating shadows of the pantry, my back pressed against the wire racks. The air in here smelled of stale spices and the metallic tang of camera gear. I held the monitor steady, my eyes locked on the frame, but my focus kept drifting to my right hand. My thumb throbbed with a sharp, rhythmic pulse, a fresh kitchen burn from the morning prep, a jagged red line across the skin that stung every time I adjusted the tripod. It was a small, ugly mark of the real labor. Leo did not see the burn. He did not see the hours of cleaning, the precise calibration of the lighting. I was the ghost in his machine, the one who edited the light to make his skin glow, and the one who cut the audio. I was the engine, but I was never meant to be seen. The camera lens captured only the curated version of reality. Leo stood under the harsh white lights, his posture carefully angled to hide the tension in his shoulders. He didn't know the chemistry of the sear, but he knew the rhythm of the lines I had spent until 3 in the morning perfecting. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to that smooth, instructional register that millions of viewers found so comforting. He recited the steps for the reduction, but his eyes flickered toward the teleprompter, searching for the next word. He paused, a fraction of a second too long, his brow furrowing as he stumbled over the term for the emulsification process. I watched him recover, flashing that practiced golden hour grin that smoothed over the error like a layer of glaze. It was a performance of competence, not the thing itself. He held the spatula with a grip that was far too tight, his knuckles white against the handle, yet he spoke of heat control with the confidence of a seasoned chef. He was a vessel for my words, a hollow shell filled with the expertise I had spent years acquiring. He was the face of the kitchen, and he was entirely, utterly empty. The red recording light flickered off, and the silence in the kitchen returned, heavy and thick. Leo exhaled, his shoulders dropping as the mask of the charismatic host slipped away. He didn't wait for a critique. He walked out, leaving the mess for me to clear. I sat at the workstation, the hum of the cooling fan, the only sound in the room. I opened the raw footage, a chaotic sprawl of stumbles and pauses. My work began in the timeline. I zoomed into the audio waveforms, hunting for the ragged, uneven spikes of his breathing. I deleted them, one by one, replacing the gaps with room tone to create a seamless, artificial calm. I scrubbed the video frame by frame, adjusting the color balance until his skin glowed with a healthy, vibrant warmth that he never possessed in the harsh light of the studio. I cut the footage where he hesitated, splicing the clips to make his speech flow with a rhythm that defied his actual, stumbling delivery. I was a surgeon of light and sound, cutting away the incompetence to reveal a polished, marketable lie. The memory smells of wet pavement and damp wool. It was 2021, and the market was a maze of gray tents huddled against a relentless, biting rain. I was there for the produce, my mind cataloging the acidity of the tomatoes and the freshness of the herbs. I moved with purpose, a professional navigating the chaos. Then, the sound of laughter cut through the drizzle. I turned. A small stall was crowded with people, all of them watching a man struggle with a cast iron pan. It was Leo. He was trying to sear a wedge of local cheese, but the heat was too high, and the smell of scorched dairy hung heavy in the humid air. He didn't know the first thing about temperature control, yet the crowd was leaning in, captivated by his smile. He joked about the smoke, turning his failure into a performance that made strangers feel like old friends. I stood back, watching the way he held their attention. I saw the raw potential of his charisma, and I saw the void where his knowledge should have been. I stepped closer, the rain soaking through my shoulders. He did. Our eyes locked, and in that crowded, dripping market, the trajectory of my life shifted. The conversation started under the awning of a nearby cafe, the rain drumming a steady rhythm against the metal roof. Leo spoke with the same ease he used to charm the market crowd, his hands moving as if he were already conducting an audience. He called it a partnership, a blending of his magnetic presence and my technical command of the kitchen. He spoke of building something massive, a brand that would rewrite the rules of digital cooking. I listened, watching the way he leaned in. To him, this was a meeting of equals, a perfect fusion of talent and style. To me, it was a calculated exchange. I saw the shortcut. I didn't correct him when he described the future as ours. I simply nodded, letting him believe he was the architect of this alliance. He provided the face, the smile, and the effortless performance that drew the masses in. It was a symbiotic arrangement. We shook hands, the deal sealed in the damp air, and I began the work of building a machine that would eventually consume us both. The transition was swift. Within weeks, the quiet order of my home was replaced by the constant, restless energy of his presence. He moved in with boxes that seemed to multiply, spilling over into the corners of my kitchen and the shelves of my study. I watched him unpack, his movements broad and careless, as he claimed the space that had once been my sanctuary. He didn't just occupy the rooms, he began to colonize my work. My notebooks, filled with years of culinary research, were suddenly moved. He would sit at my desk, his fingers tracing the lines of my spreadsheets, asking questions that betrayed his ignorance. I stood in the doorway, my hands gripping the frame, watching him rearrange my life to suit his narrative. Every time he opened a drawer or shifted a file, I felt the boundaries of my world thinning. He was everywhere now. He didn't realize that by moving into my space, he was handing me the keys to his own undoing. The domestic chaos was merely a distraction. While he practiced his smiles in the mirror, I retreated to the sterile quiet of my home office to build the cage. I began with the LLC, drafting the articles of incorporation with the cold, surgical precision of a master chef reducing a sauce. Every clause was a blade. Every stipulation was a lock. I didn't just register a business. I constructed a legal fortress. I filed the paperwork at the county clerk's office, the heavy stamp of the notary echoing like a gavel in the empty room. Next came the trademark. I secured the name, the logo, and the digital footprint, ensuring that every asset was tethered exclusively to my identity. I spent nights cross-referencing state statutes, stripping away any ambiguity that could allow him a foothold. By the time I finished, the entity was a closed loop. I was the sole member, the registered agent, and the final authority. He was merely an employee in a company he thought he owned. The foundation was set, the walls were reinforced, and the trap was perfectly complete. The final document arrived on the kitchen island, resting on the marble like a predator waiting for its prey. I slid the folder toward him while he was busy adjusting the lighting for our next shoot. He didn't even look at the pages. His attention was locked on the camera lens, checking his own reflection, practicing the angle of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. He was so enamored with the image he projected that the reality on the table became invisible. I pointed to the signature line with a steady finger. He laughed, a hollow sound that bounced off the tiles, and grabbed the pen without a second thought. He flipped past the terms of service, the liability waivers, and the ownership clauses as if they were nothing more than packing paper. He didn't read a single line. He didn't ask a single question. He scribbled his name across the bottom of the page with a flourish. I watched the ink dry, a permanent mark of his own negligence. The deal was done. The cage was locked. The algorithm finally took the bait. It started with a trickle of notifications, then a steady stream, and within 48 hours, it became a deluge. The numbers on the dashboard climbed with a frantic, rhythmic pulse that kept me awake for 3 days straight. Millions of viewers flooded the channel, their comments scrolling past faster than I could read. Every refresh brought a new surge of subscribers, a digital tidal wave that turned our small project into a global phenomenon. I monitored the server load, adjusted the bandwidth, and optimized the metadata to feed the machine. Leo watched the view counts climb and assumed his charisma was the sole catalyst. He didn't see the hours of editing, the precise audio balancing, or the strategic timing of every upload that kept the audience hooked. He saw only the vanity metrics and the growing influence. The comment section filled with praise for his presence. Unaware that every frame was a calculated construction, the success was a whirlwind. I spent my nights in the glow of the monitor, ensuring the momentum never faltered. The channel was exploding, and while the world cheered for the face on the screen, I was the one holding the reins of the firestorm. The invitations arrived in digital waves, beckoning Leo to the coast for high-level meetings. He packed his bags with a frantic energy, eager to trade the kitchen for the boardroom. I watched him leave from the window, the house suddenly quiet, the silence heavy with the hum of the server rack. He spent his days in LA shaking hands and signing deals, convinced he was the architect of his own ascent. I stayed in the dark, the glow of the monitor my only companion. I received the raw files from his trips. I spent hours scrubbing the audio, removing the background noise, and stitching his disjointed sentences into a coherent narrative. He was the face on the screen, but I was the one who decided what the world saw. I sat in the chair he vacated, the keyboard clicking under my fingers, and continued to edit the legacy he was too busy to understand. Leo returned from the coast with a new vocabulary of industry buzzwords and a complete detachment from the kitchen floor. He walked through the house like a guest, his attention fixed on his phone, checking engagement stats as if they were his own personal heartbeat. He started sitting behind me while I worked, offering critiques on pacing that betrayed his total lack of technical knowledge. He wanted more flash, more ego, more of the persona he had cultivated in the boardrooms of LA. I kept my hands on the mouse, my eyes locked on the timeline, listening to him talk about his brand as if it were a separate entity. He didn't ask about the lighting setups or the audio compression anymore. He assumed the quality was a natural byproduct of his presence. The physical distance between us grew with every passing hour. He occupied the living room while I remained anchored to the desk. He was rehearsing lines for a future he thought he had secured, oblivious to the fact that the entire structure rested on my silent, steady work. The nights became my only territory. While Leo slept, I sat in the blue glare of the monitor, frame by frame, fixing the mess he left behind. I spent hours color correcting the footage, stripping away the dullness of his performance to make him look vibrant, capable, and sharp. My eyes burned and my fingers ached from the endless clicking, but the work demanded precision. I had to remove the hesitation in his voice, the long pauses where he forgot his lines, and the moments he looked at the camera with confusion. Every time I zoomed in on his face to smooth a transition, the resentment tightened in my chest like a knot. I was crafting a version of him that didn't exist, a man who understood the craft, while the real man in the next room was just a hollow shell of ego. I scrubbed through the timeline, deleting his mistakes, one by one until the video was perfect. I looked down at my own hands, stained with ink and dry from the keyboard, and then back at the screen, where his face smiled back, polished and fake. I was exhausted, yet I couldn't stop. I was the one holding the reality together. The shift in tone was subtle at first, then absolute. Leo stopped calling our work a partnership and started referring to the channel as his personal platform. He walked into the kitchen while I was mid-render, pulled up a chair, and began listing tasks as if I were a hired hand. He wanted the cuts faster, the music louder, and the focus entirely on his reactions. He didn't care about the cooking process anymore. He wanted the spectacle. When I tried to explain the technical necessity of the current pacing, he waved a hand at me, dismissing the logic before I could finish the sentence. He told me to stop overthinking the craft and start focusing on his brand identity. His voice had lost its warmth, replaced by the sharp, impatient cadence. He demanded I prioritize his social media clips over the main video, insisting that my time was better spent feeding his ego than perfecting the content. I watched him tap his fingers on the counter, waiting for me to nod and agree, his eyes scanning the room for flaws he could blame on me. He was no longer asking for help. He was issuing orders. Every word he spoke stripped away the last remnants of our shared history. If you've ever done the work while someone else got the credit, hit pause and subscribe to Midnight Confessions. We tell stories of people who were invisible and then became unforgettable. Subscribe. I stopped arguing. I stopped trying to justify the craft to a man who only saw numbers. Instead, I retreated to my desk, the one place he never bothered to look. I opened the encrypted folder on my laptop, the one containing every contract, every trademark, and every LLC filing I had meticulously drafted since the beginning. My fingers flew across the keys, pulling up the original articles of incorporation. I scanned the fine print, searching for the structural weaknesses he might try to exploit. There, on page 2, was the clause I had insisted on from day one. I had designated myself as the sole member, a detail he had signed off on without a second glance, blinded by his own reflection in the camera lens. I tightened the language, adding a layer of digital protection that would render his claims void if he ever tried to seize the channel. I cross-referenced the bank accounts and the intellectual property rights, ensuring every digital asset was tethered directly to my name. I was not just editing videos anymore. I was building a fortress. I saved the documents, backed them up to a secure drive, and locked the folder. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with his demands. It was the quiet of a trap being set, precise and inevitable. Leo started spending his mornings scrolling through his phone instead of prepping the ingredients. He would pause, tap the screen, and show me clips of a wellness influencer who curated a lifestyle of green juices. He began to mimic her cadence, using words like vibe and alignment to describe our cooking segments. One afternoon, he left his phone unlocked on the counter. I saw the notifications, a string of messages from her. When I questioned this shift, he told me that my focus on the craft was outdated and the influencer understood the market. He started changing the lighting in the kitchen to match her aesthetic, ignoring my notes on color balance. He was no longer interested in the food. He was chasing a curated image that he believed would elevate him. He had already decided that I was the obstacle in his path to this new, hollow version of fame. The kitchen became a silent battlefield where only the sound of the knife against the board remained. Leo stopped asking for my input on the recipes. When I suggested a temperature adjustment to prevent the pan from smoking, he simply stared past me, his jaw set, and continued exactly as he had planned. He began moving my mise en place to the far end of the counter, clearing space for his own equipment as if I were a guest in my own workspace. Our conversation shrank to monosyllabic commands. He would ask for a clean towel or a fresh battery, his tone devoid of the warmth he once feigned for the camera. There was no more talk of our future or the growth of the channel. Instead, he treated me like a piece of production gear, a necessary static object. I watched him from the corner of the room, recording every interaction, noting the way he refused to make eye contact even when I stood directly in his path. Every time I spoke, he checked his watch or adjusted his phone. The air between us grew thin and sharp. We were two strangers. The camera was rolling, but the kitchen felt like a tomb. Leo stood at the stove, his movements exaggerated and performative. I gave him the cue for the reduction, a precise technique that required patience and steady heat. He laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the tiles, and cranked the burner to its highest setting. The pan hissed violently, the delicate liquid scorching in seconds. He looked directly into the lens, winked, and started ad-libbing a ridiculous monologue about intuitive cooking that ignored every fundamental rule I had taught him. He was making a mockery of the process, treating the ingredients like props in a low-budget comedy. I held the camera steady, my thumb throbbing, recording the way he tossed the pan with reckless amateur confidence. He didn't care about the burnt smell filling the room or the ruined sauce. He only cared about how he looked while the pan smoked. He kept glancing at the monitor, checking his own reflection, completely oblivious to the fact that he was destroying the very foundation of the content that had built his fame. I didn't say a word. The camera clicked off, but the performance did not end. Leo strutted toward the living room, tossing his apron onto the counter with a careless flick. He was already scrolling through his phone, checking engagement metrics, and laughing at his own jokes. I remained in the kitchen, the silence now a deliberate, heavy shroud. While he distracted himself with his own digital reflection, I moved to the laptop. My fingers flew across the keys, finalizing the last of the contracts I had drafted in the dead of night. I reviewed the LLC registration and the trademark filings, each line a calculated strike against his ego. He was so consumed by his own perceived brilliance that he never once looked at the folders I left on the desk. I watched him from the doorway, his back turned, completely unaware that he had signed away his relevance months ago. My silence was no longer a sign of submission. It was the final gear in a machine he had built for me. I saved the documents to a secure drive and closed the laptop. The kitchen was cold, the air still, and the trap was perfectly set. He walked past me, still grinning at his screen, and I did not blink. I simply waited. The end was not a confrontation, it was a formality. The house settled into a heavy, unnatural quiet. I moved through the kitchen, wiping down the marble until it shone like ice under the recessed lights. Every movement was deliberate, a ritual of detachment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes in their frames, but inside, the air remained stagnant. I stood by the sink, watching the reflection of the living room in the darkened window. It looked like a stage set after the actors had left, hollow and waiting. Leo was in the other room, his presence a dull vibration against the floorboards. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of his fingers against his phone screen, a frantic, hollow sound that filled the gaps in the silence. I didn't move to join him. I didn't offer a drink or a word. I simply stood there, listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to mark the seconds. I felt the weight of the folder in the drawer behind me, a physical anchor in the room. The storm was gathering, not outside, but in the space between us. I checked the clock. The time for pretense had evaporated. Every shadow in the kitchen seemed to sharpen, waiting for the inevitable shift. I turned off the main light, leaving the room in a dim, gray haze, and waited. The bedroom door clicked shut, a final, sharp sound that severed the last thread of our routine. I followed at a distance, my footsteps silent on the hardwood. Leo was already sitting on the edge of the mattress, his posture rigid, his attention entirely consumed by the device in his palm. He did not look up when I entered. He did not acknowledge the space I occupied. The only light in the room came from the screen, a harsh, artificial blue that bled across his features, draining the warmth from his skin and casting deep, jagged shadows against the wall. He tapped the glass with a rhythmic, impatient force, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for an exit strategy. The glow illuminated the sharp angles of his jaw and the hollows beneath his eyes, turning him into a stranger in the dimness. He finally stopped tapping, held his breath, and the blue light caught the edge of his teeth as he prepared to speak. Leo spoke, and his voice lacked the cadence of a man ending a 3-year life. It was flat, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of history. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the blue glow of the screen, his thumb hovering over the glass. He told me he was leaving. He mentioned a name, a wellness influencer who curated vibes, as if describing a new brand of cookware. Each word landed with a sterile, clinical precision that erased the years we spent editing, filming, and surviving together. He spoke of alignment and aesthetic synergy, terms that belonged in a pitch deck, not a bedroom. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. The air in the bedroom grew thin. I watched his lips move, forming the hollow syllables of his new reality. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the late nights or the sacrifices. He was simply moving on to a more profitable frame. He finished his sentence, the silence ringing louder than words, and finally he looked up, his expression empty as the promises. His gaze finally locked onto mine, but there was no recognition in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man clearing space for his next act. He stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, as if he were performing for an invisible audience. He walked toward me, his hands tucked into his pockets, his chin tilted at an angle that suggested he was already looking down at me from a pedestal. He gestured vaguely at the walls, at the life I had built, and dismissed it all with a single, sharp exhale. He told me the channel was his. He said it with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his own marketing. He didn't stop there. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a patronizing, measured tone, and told me I was entirely replaceable. He claimed the audience was there for his face, his grin, his curated presence, and that I was merely a technician. He waited for me to crumble, his expression smug, his posture radiating a hollow, arrogant triumph that filled every corner of the room. I did not blink, I did not pull away. I stood in the center of the room, my hands hanging loose at my sides, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a tear or a tremor. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, pulling the air from his lungs. Leo shifted his weight, his smug expression flickering as he realized his words had failed to land. He looked for a crack in my composure, a sign of hurt, but found only a blank, steady focus. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet, and took a half step back. He had expected a scene, a plea, or a collapse. Instead, he was met with a wall of absolute, chilling stillness. The power in the room began to tilt. I watched his eyes dart around, searching for a way to regain control, but he was trapped by the very void he had created. I felt the pulse in my wrist, slow and steady, a rhythm of cold resolve. I did not speak. I did not need to. I let the silence hold him for one more heartbeat, watching the confusion deepen in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak again, perhaps to fill the void with more hollow noise, but I turned away. My movement was slow, measured, and entirely devoid of the frantic energy he had expected. I walked toward the nightstand, the floorboards silent beneath my feet. Every step felt like a deliberate strike against the foundation he thought he owned. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool wood of the drawer, and slid it open with a soft, metallic scrape. Inside, resting against the dark interior, lay the folder. It was thick, heavy with the weight of 3 years of meticulous, cold-blooded planning. I wrapped my hand around the edges, feeling the sharp corners of the documents that would dismantle his entire world. I did not rush. I pulled it out, feeling the texture of the paper. I turned back to face him, and the air in the room seemed to sharpen. I did not open the folder yet. I let it rest against my palm, a heavy, silent anchor in the center of the room. Leo stared at the manila cover, his head tilted slightly, a flicker of confusion warring with his practiced bravado. He let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind he used when a recipe failed on camera, but the sound lacked its usual polish. It died instantly in the stagnant air. He took a step forward, his hand twitching at his side, as if he wanted to snatch the folder away. But he stopped when he saw the way I held it, not as a plea, but as a weapon. His eyes darted from my face to the document, searching for a joke, a bluff, or a sign of weakness. He found none. The blue light from the screen cast long, jagged shadows across his features, highlighting the sudden tightness in his jaw. His breathing, once steady and performative, became shallow and uneven. He was reading the gravity in my posture, the absolute lack of hesitation in my grip. The arrogance that had defined his posture began to drain away. I flipped the cover back. The sound of the paper tearing slightly in the quiet room was like a gunshot. I held the page out, not toward him, but directly into the path of his vision. He didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to the ink like a moth to a flame. I watched his pupils dilate as he scanned the lines I had drafted with such surgical precision. My thumb rested on the critical clause, the one that rendered his entire performance irrelevant. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to threaten. I simply pointed to the bottom of the page, where the legal reality was etched in black and white. I spoke the words clearly, my voice steady and devoid of any tremor. Sole member, Elena Vasquez. The name hung in the air, cold and final. I watched the realization hit him, a physical impact that made him recoil as if he had been struck. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Leo's face underwent a slow, agonizing transformation. The practiced charm that had served him for years evaporated, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. His eyes darted across the page again, desperate to find a loophole, a mistake, anything to salvage his status. He reached out to touch the paper, but his fingers trembled so violently he pulled them back, clutching his own arms instead. He tried to speak. This isn't possible, he whispered, but the words lacked conviction. I watched the color drain from his skin, his features slackening into a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. He wasn't just losing a business, he was losing the identity he had carefully constructed from my work. The realization was absolute, carving deep lines of defeat into his expression. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, as if the air itself had solidified around him. I watched the metaphor take shape. The legal reveal functioned like a heavy iron key sliding into a lock and turning with a final echoing click. He was sealed in. The negligence he had shown for years, the way he had ignored every contract and every detail I placed before him, had finally formed the walls of his own prison. He looked toward the door, then back at the desk, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Every step he took felt weighted, restricted by the reality of the document on the table. He was no longer the man who commanded a lens. He was a man caught in the machinery of his own making. I watched him try to pace, but the room seemed to shrink, the boundaries defined by the paper trail I had meticulously laid. He reached for the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood, seeking stability where none existed. The lock was set. The mechanism was irreversible. He stood there, trapped by the very indifference he had once used to dismiss my work. He stopped struggling, paralyzed. Leo finally found his voice, though it emerged as a jagged, uneven rasp. He began to argue, his hands sweeping through the air in frantic, disjointed gestures. He claimed the channel was his vision, his brand, his life. He paced the small perimeter of the room, his movements erratic, trying to project the confidence that had once captivated millions. But his words were empty shells. Every point he raised, I countered with a single, precise gesture toward the folder. He lunged for the papers, intending to tear them, to scatter the evidence of his own insignificance. But he stopped inches away. The sheer volume of the documentation acted as a physical barrier. He stood over the desk, chest heaving, his face contorted in a silent snarl of frustration. He tried to invoke our history, the early days of the market, the shared meals, but each memory felt distant and irrelevant against the cold, hard facts on the page. He slammed his palm against the wood, a sharp, sudden sound that echoed in the quiet room. The table didn't move. The papers didn't shift. His fight was a wave breaking against a cliff. He realized then that he had no ground to stand on, no leverage to use, and no audience to witness his protest. He was fighting a fortress, and the walls were made of his own signatures. I pushed the folder closer to him, sliding it across the polished surface with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes followed the movement, lingering on the thick stack of stapled pages. I pointed to the third paragraph on page 2, where the intellectual property rights were defined with surgical clarity. Every video, every thumbnail, every frame of footage was legally classified as work for hire, owned exclusively by the LLC. I traced the line where he had signed his name, the ink dark and permanent against the white paper. I highlighted the clause regarding the trademark, showing him how the brand name belonged to the entity, and the entity belonged entirely to me. He leaned in, his breathing shallow as he read the words again. The realization hit him in waves. He was not just losing his job. He was losing the entire infrastructure of his existence. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of his failed ambition. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a single, pre-printed check. I filled in the amount with a steady hand, the pen scratching against the paper like a final verdict. $40,000. It was a calculated sum, enough to satisfy a clean break, but far less than the empire he had imagined was his. I slid the check across the desk, the paper coming to rest right over his signature on the contract. It was a severance package, a final transaction. He looked at the number, his eyes darting from the digits to my face, searching for a sign of negotiation. There was none. I stood up, my posture rigid, and gestured toward the door. The terms were simple. He takes the money, he signs the release. He looked at the check, then at the empty, dark hallway beyond the bedroom door. The reality of his situation settled in. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking, and signed the release. The transaction was complete. He stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed, a final, jarring note in the quiet room. He did not look at me again. He walked toward the bedroom door, his movements stiff, stripped of the practiced grace he had spent years perfecting. I watched him cross the threshold, his reflection catching in the hallway mirror for a fleeting second before he moved beyond it. He stopped at the front door. He reached for the handle, hesitated, and glanced back at the kitchen, the stage where he had once stood. The marble countertop remained cold and white, indifferent to his presence. He turned the lock, The mechanism clicked. He stepped out into the night, the cool air rushing in to replace the stagnant atmosphere of the house. I did not follow him. I stood in the center of the room, listening to his footsteps retreat down the driveway, the sound growing fainter until it was swallowed by the distance. I reached for the light switch, flicked it, and left the room in darkness. The house was mine again. The work was waiting. The house breathed again, the air clearing of his lingering presence. I walked into the kitchen and wiped the marble surface, removing the faint traces of his time there. I pulled my own laptop from the bag, the screen glowing with the unfinished edits of a new project. The dishwasher hummed, a steady, rhythmic sound that replaced the silence he left behind. I opened the files, the spreadsheets, and the scripts that had been mine from the start. I adjusted the lighting, moving the lamps to highlight the workspace rather than the person. I stood at the center of the room, my hands resting on the cool stone. I picked up a knife, feeling the weight and balance of the steel. I was the architect, the engine, and the face of the brand. I set up the camera, checked the frame, and pressed record. The red light blinked, steady and unwavering. I looked directly into the lens, not for a grin, but for the work. I spoke the words I had lived by for 3 years. Cook like no one is watching. I finally understood the truth of the craft. He had needed an audience to exist, but I only ever needed the kitchen. The pan hit the burner with a sharp, metallic ring. I did not need to look at the monitor to know the frame was perfect. The sizzle of the shallots hitting the oil filled the room, a sound I had once muted to hide his incompetence. Now, it was the soundtrack of my own precision. I moved with the economy of a professional. Every slice measured, every motion deliberate. The spotlight was no longer a tool for manipulation. It was simply a lamp above a workspace. I watched the steam rise, curling into the light, and realized the audience had not blinked when the name changed. They were never there for the golden hour grin or the practiced charm. They were there for the reduction, the sear, and the truth of the craft. I plated the dish, the colors vibrant against the white marble. I turned off the camera, the red light dying with a soft click. The kitchen was quiet again, but it was a productive silence, heavy with the weight of real labor. I sat at the table, the work finished, and the legacy secured. He had chased a ghost of relevance, but I had built a fortress of skill. The spotlight is a fragile thing that burns out, but the work remains. I picked up the fork, tasted the result of my own hands, and finally I was home. The kitchen lights dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the stovetop. I cleaned the blade, the steel reflecting the quiet room. There was no trace of him left in the cabinets, no residue of his presence on the counters. He had walked away with his $40,000, chasing irrelevance that evaporated the moment he stepped out of my frame. I watched the city lights through the window, steady and distant. He had needed the applause of strangers to validate his existence, a hollow cycle that demanded constant attention. I had never needed that. My satisfaction came from the resistance of the ingredients, the precise timing of the heat, and the final result on the plate. I put the knife back in the block, the click of metal against wood, the only sound in the house. The contract was archived, the LLC was secure, and the channel was mine. I didn't look for his name in the comments or his face in the search bars. He was a closed chapter. I turned the main switch, the room falling into a dark stillness. Morning light hit the marble, cold and uncompromising. I wiped the surface, the cloth moving in steady, rhythmic arcs. There was no residue of his presence, no lingering echo of his practiced, golden hour grin. The kitchen was a vacuum where only the truth of the craft survived. I checked the inventory, the spreadsheets, and the contracts. Everything was in its place, a fortress of my own design. He had chased the spotlight, a flickering, fragile thing that burned out the moment he tried to hold it. I had chosen the work, the slow, deliberate accumulation of skill that required no validation from the crowd. I stood in the center of the room, the silence no longer a weight, but a clarity. I reached for the knife, the weight of the handle familiar and grounding. The channel, the brand, the life, it was all mine. I didn't need the applause to know the sear was perfect or the reduction was balanced. I turned the burner on. The pan hissed, a sharp, singular sound that filled the room. I began to cook, not for the lens, but for the sake of the craft itself. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the kitchen floor. I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. There was no need for the camera tonight. No need for the scripts, the lighting rigs, or the curated smiles that once defined my days. I walked to the counter and touched the cool white marble. It was just a surface now, a tool for the work, not a stage for a performance. He had needed an audience to exist, a constant stream of validation to fill the void. I had only ever needed the kitchen. The ingredients, the heat, the transformation, these were the constants that never failed. I picked up the chef knife, feeling the balance of the steel in my palm. It was a familiar weight, a reminder of the years spent in the dark. I didn't look back at the empty space where he used to stand. I didn't think of the millions who watched or the fame he had so desperately chased. I turned back to the stove, the flame blooming blue and steady. I began to cook. The work was eternal, and finally, I was the only one who needed to see it. The kitchen is quiet now, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the wall clock. I have dismantled the lighting rigs and packed away the tripods that once dominated this space. Every corner is reclaimed. I reach for a shallot, peeling back the papery skin with surgical precision, feeling the familiar resistance of the blade against the cutting board. He is a ghost of a different season, a fleeting shadow that dissolved the moment the legal papers were signed. I do not look for his reflection in the darkened window. I do not wait for the sound of his heavy, uncertain breathing in the pantry. Those days are buried under layers of routine and genuine mastery. I heat the pan, the oil shimmering with a perfect golden clarity. There is no script to recite, no audience to appease, and no ego to manage. I am the architect of this environment. The spotlight was always a fragile, hollow thing, but the work remains. I finish the dish, plating it with a steady hand. I am finally home. The final dish sits on the counter, steam rising in a thin, steady ribbon. I turn off the burner, the sudden silence of the gas line clicking shut, marking the end of the night. There is no camera recording this. No one is waiting for a cut, a color grade, or a polished monologue. I pick up the plate and walk to the table. The house is mine, the kitchen is mine, and the success is built on a foundation that cannot be trademarked away by someone else. I remember the rainy market, the way he burned cheese while charming strangers, and how I once thought his charisma was a shortcut to my own goals. That was a lifetime ago. I have replaced his hollow vanity with the weight of real skill. I sit down, the chair scraping against the floor, and take the first bite. It is perfect. The flavor is sharp, honest, and entirely my own. He needed an audience to exist, a mirror to reflect his own image back at him. I only ever needed the kitchen. The spotlight was a fragile, flickering thing that burned out the moment the power shifted. But the work remains. It is the only legacy that holds weight. I am the architect, the engine, and the face. I am finally, completely, at peace. The kitchen is quiet now, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the wall clock. I have dismantled the lighting rigs and packed away the tripods that once dominated this space. Every corner is reclaimed. I reach for a shallot, peeling back the papery skin with surgical precision, feeling the familiar resistance of the blade against the cutting board. He is a ghost of a different season, a fleeting shadow that dissolved the moment the legal papers were signed. I do not look for his reflection in the darkened window. I do not wait for the sound of his heavy, uncertain breathing in the pantry. Those days are buried under layers of routine and genuine mastery. I heat the pan, the oil shimmering with a perfect golden clarity. There is no script to recite, no audience to appease, and no ego to manage. I am the architect of this environment. But the work, the discipline of the sear, the patience of the reduction, that remains. I finish the dish, plating it with a steady hand. I am finally home. The last of the prep work is done. I wipe the marble surface until it reflects nothing but the clean, white light of the overhead lamp. There is no one left to impress, no lens to angle, and no script to memorize. I think back to the rainy market in 2021, The way he charmed strangers while the food turned to ash. It seems like a scene from a film I once edited, detached and distant. He was a performer who needed a stage, but I was the one who built the theater. I pick up my knife, the weight of the steel familiar and grounding in my palm. The silence in the house is not empty. It is full of potential. I have replaced his hollow vanity with the weight of real skill. I sit down at the table, the chair scraping against the floor, and take the first bite of the meal. It is perfect. The flavor is sharp, honest, and entirely my own. He needed an audience to exist, a mirror to reflect his own image back at him. But the work remains. It is the only legacy that holds weight. I am the architect, the engine, and the face. I am finally, completely, at peace. The camera sits on the shelf, cold and inert. I no longer feel the urge to check the focus or adjust the white balance. The kitchen is mine, not a set, not a stage, but a place of deliberate creation. I remember the way he moved, always performing for an invisible audience, always waiting for applause that never truly understood the craft. That life is a closed chapter, a file moved to the archive and deleted. I turn the burner off. The hiss of the gas dies instantly, leaving a silence that is rich and heavy with intent. I have learned the hardest lesson of all. Fame is a ghost, but the work is a foundation. When I say cook like no one is watching, I am not offering a slogan. I am stating a fact of my existence. I do not need the validation of millions to know the quality of a sear or the balance of a reduction. I am the architect of my own legacy, and for the first time, the house is built on stone. I am home. The light through the window shifts, casting long, steady shadows across the floor. I watch the dust motes dance in the air, undisturbed by the frantic energy that once defined this space. There is no script to follow, no timing to hit, and no need to edit the truth of my movements. I look at the knife block, the steel blades gleaming in the afternoon sun. They are tools, not props. They serve a purpose that requires no audience to validate. He was a flicker of light that burned out, leaving nothing but the silence of a room that finally belongs to its maker. I pick up a single herb, feeling the texture of the leaf against my thumb, and begin to chop. The rhythm is steady, precise, and entirely my own. The kitchen has returned to its original state, a place of work, not a stage for vanity. I do not look for a lens. I do not look for a reflection. I simply cook. The legacy I built is not in the views or the numbers, but in the heat of the pan and the clarity of the result. I am finally, completely at peace. The sun dips below the horizon, and the kitchen cools. I wipe the surface clean, the granite smooth and cold beneath my palm. There is no camera recording this. There is no one waiting for a performance. For years, I measured my worth in the metrics of a screen, but tonight, the only measurement is the perfect sear on the pan. He needed an audience to exist, a constant stream of eyes to confirm he was real. I never needed that. I only ever needed the kitchen. The ingredients are simple, the process is honest, and the result is mine alone. I turn off the overhead light. The room settles into a deep, comfortable shadow. I am not the ghost in the machine anymore. I am the machine itself, the architect of my own quiet, enduring success. The noise of the past has faded into nothingness. I walk out of the kitchen, the floorboards quiet under my feet. The work is done. The story is complete. The house is quiet now, the kind of silence that only settles when every debt is paid and every ghost has been evicted. I sit at the table, the wood grain cool against my wrists. There are no spreadsheets to review, no contracts to draft, and no flicker of a blue screen to distort the reality of the room. The air smells of rosemary and toasted garlic, the lingering evidence of a meal prepared for no one but myself. I think of the rainy market in 2021, a distant memory that no longer carries any weight. It is a closed chapter, a footnote in a life that has finally found its true rhythm. I stand up, walk to the window, and look out at the dark street. The world outside is moving, but in here, time has stopped. I have built a fortress of skill and precision that requires no external validation to stand. I turn away from the window. The kitchen is dark, but it is mine. The story ends here, in the stillness. I close the door. The cycle is complete. The final light fades. I do not reach for the switch. There is no need to illuminate a space that I have already mastered. My hands are steady, the skin unblemished, the rhythm of my pulse matching the stillness of the room. I spent years editing the light for someone else, cutting away the truth to make a lie look beautiful. Now, the truth is the only thing left. It is in the weight of the knife, the texture of the grain, and the absolute certainty that I am the architect of this life. The noise of the world, the millions of eyes, the hollow promises of fame, they are all echoes in a room I have long since vacated. But the work is eternal. It is the foundation that remains when the audience leaves and the screens go dark. I am the engine. I am the face. I am the one who remains. The story is finished. I am home. The final light fades. I do not reach for the switch. There is no need to illuminate a space that I have already mastered. My hands are steady, the skin unblemished, the rhythm of my pulse matching the stillness of the room. I spent years editing the light for someone else, cutting away the truth to make a lie look beautiful. Now, the truth is the only thing left. It is in the weight of the knife, the texture of the grain, and the absolute certainty that I am the architect of this life. The noise of the world, the millions of eyes, the hollow promises of fame, they are all echoes in a room I have long since vacated. But the work is eternal. It is the foundation that remains when the audience leaves and the screens go dark. I am the engine. I am the face. I am the one who remains. The story is finished. I am home. If this story reminded you that the real power was never in the spotlight, it was always in the work, please like and subscribe to Midnight Confessions. We tell stories of people who were underestimated and came back stronger. The quiet ones are always watching, and we never forget.